Okay, we're going to switch gears here a little bit, although there are some relationships between what I was talking about earlier. So this is on social and psychological mechanisms of group cohesion, and one of the biggest problems in evolutionary thinking has been, how does natural selection operate? Does natural selection operate at the level of the genes? Does it operate at the level of individuals or at the level of groups? And for example, selection at the level of the genes, then there is competition within the genome for which genes will become part of the fertilized egg. So that is what we call intergenomic conflict. And the technical name is meiotic drive. Genes compete to be represented in the sperm or the egg that's actually fertilized. And there's a classic example of that. In mice, you have this T locus, which affects tail length and so on. If you have two T's, the homozygote, they're normal. That's the normal situation. If you have the heterozygote, they have the short tails. But what's interesting is that 90% of the sperm from these short-tailed mice have the small t recessive gene in the sperm. But if you have both of these small t's, if you have both of these recessive genes, then you're sterile. Okay, so that's not good. So this is the meiotic drive, the 90%. I mean, on average, you'd expect it to be 50%. The sperm are either going to be T or big T or little t should be 50%. But for somehow this small t manages to elbow out the others and have the lion's share. And so what's interesting is that as a meiotic drive increases the frequency of this small t allele to the point where it becomes frequent enough to produce a substantial number of these homozygotes. But when that happens, of course, then you have sterility, and natural selection will, of course, work against sterile offspring. But it's interesting that it shows that there are these different levels of natural selection, and that positive selection for the T gene at the level of the gene, with this meiotic drive, but you have negative selection against it at the level of the individual when you get these sterile combinations. And again, ask me any questions if you have as I go along. So the second level is at the level of individuals, and this is the most obvious thing. It doesn't take a degree in psychology or biology to realize that animals compete within their own groups. They compete among individuals. We see it every day in human society. Humans are competing for various things. And so most evolutionary people would suppose that natural selection operates most importantly, most effectively at the level of the individual. So the idea is that most of our mind is designed to deal with competition between individuals in a group. But what about groups? Groups, certainly sometimes animals and humans are arrayed in groups. And the question is, does natural selection work at the level of the group? If selection does act at the level of the group, then there would have to be competition between the groups for reproductive success. And instead of thinking about the individual as having more reproductive success, you think in terms of groups doing better or not doing better. Charles Darwin believed in group selection. This is the famous quote from Charles Darwin. These days it's very easy to find pictures of people on the internet, so here he is. It must not be forgotten that although a high standard of morality gives but a slight advantage to each individual man and his children of the same tribe, yet an increase in the number of well-endowed men and advancement in the standard of morality will certainly give an immense advantage to one tribe over another. A tribe including many members who, possessing a high degree of spirit of patriotism, fidelity, obedience, courage, and sympathy, who were always ready to aid one another, would be victorious over most other tribes, and this would be natural selection. This is a very good statement of natural selection at the level of the group. Notice he's hypothesizing a group as very strongly cohesive, that they're able, the very high sense of group identity, they're very patriotic, willing to sacrifice. And notice, sacrificing themselves for the common good. That means altruism. And modern biologists have said, hold it. We can't imagine how that could evolve, that there's something wrong with group selection, that altruism is a no-no. And so the central theoretical problem about group selection is, can altruistic groups evolve? So that this was subjected to a huge amount of investigation, mathematical models, books, huge amount of literature on it. And the basic question is, can altruistic groups evolve? Is that an important part of nature? And the common wisdom, though, is that selfish individuals will always out-reproduce altruists within groups, so that it is unlikely that altruistic groups could evolve. And that is essentially where things were. But what I started thinking about was that humans are a little different from animals. And I think a lot of the reason why we are different from animals is what I was talking about in the first lecture. We're talking about general intelligence, the ability to keep things in working memory and so on. But as applied to groups, the idea is that humans and perhaps some animals can exclude or punish cheaters. In other words, non-altruists who defect from group goals or pursue individual interests. In other words, if you had a group of say, wolves or turtles or something like that, and they were sort of an altruistic group, there were genes for altruism. The theoretical problem always was, well, what if there was a selfish turtle? What if there was a selfish wolf? What if there was a selfish chimpanzee? That guy is essentially a free rider. He's going to get all the benefits of being in the group, and he's not going to pay the costs. And so guess who's going to win the evolutionary game? Obviously, this cheater is going to win. And so within groups, we see that there's no way to prevent selfish individuals from prospering. But the question is, can humans do this? And what we're saying is that humans are able to punish cheaters, they're able to monitor group boundaries and so on. My first example is simply a unit of the army or the military, something like that, where if you join the military, essentially they are going to make sure that you are on page, that you are sort of altruistic. In other words, if you don't want to, if you say, well, I'm an individual, I don't want to do all the exercises, I don't want to do all the training, I want to be part of the army, but I'm not going to do all this stuff. Well, guess what's going to happen to you? You're going to go to jail. They're going to make life miserable for you. So the point is, humans are able to develop a very cohesive military unit, one that is highly disciplined, and if someone does try to cheat, you can simply get rid of them. Now, what I'm saying is that that's probably not the case with any animal species. And again, it has to do fundamentally with our greater intellectual abilities, our ability to monitor other people, to monitor cheaters. And of course, that's a lot of what we do. If you are in a group, you want to make sure that people that don't pay their dues, don't get to be a member. If you're on a hunting expedition and somebody just doesn't want to, work, he doesn't want to do the job, he doesn't want to pull his fair share, well, then you get rid of him. And so we're able to do that. I don't think other animals are able to do that. So the basic idea is that by using social controls, humans, and being able to monitor other people, humans are able to create groups that are more or less altruistic, even though they may, at a psychological level, be selfish. So I'm not making the claim that suddenly humans are altruistic or something like that. I'm assuming that basically humans are selfish, that for 99% of our human evolution, the great majority of it has been natural selection at the individual level, where we see competition within societies and so on, within people in the same society, but that it is nevertheless possible for humans to create focused altruistic groups which are able to exclude cheaters and essentially solve the free riding problem. In the same way, if you are a member of an organization, you find a person who's not paying the dues, you may get rid of him. That's essentially what the basic idea is. And there's been some interesting research by a guy named Christopher Bain. He's at the University of Southern California. He studies hunter-gatherer groups. And he emphasizes that hunter-gatherer groups have a very egalitarian ethic. In other words, there's a strong emphasis on sharing resources and on curbing the power of leaders. Well, if you look at these hunter-gatherer groups, you don't have a despot who's sort of lording it over everyone, telling everyone what to do and so on. That if a person were to try to do that, you've got all of these other people whose interests are not in that direction, and they curb this person's leadership abilities. And in fact, there are cases where someone who has tried to be sort of despotic as a leader has been removed from the group or executed, expelled, and so on. And so these groups are able to punish free riders. It's fairly common, fairly extensive, and they sort of rely on consensus decision making as opposed to someone, on top as a despot, telling everybody what to do and so on. Now, social controls are a huge, wide range of social controls, obviously. Teenage kids, children use gossip. They withhold social benefits. They won't invite you to a party. They ostracize people, expel people, and at the extreme end, execution. People who simply are not on the same page. If you're in a military unit and you disobey some of these sort of serious commands, you are liable to be executed. And so the bottom line is, as Bain emphasizes, that natural selection starts to be sort of weak within the group, relatively weak within the group, and relatively strong between groups. It's weak within the group because the groups tend towards egalitarianism. They prevent any one person from getting too high a position. And they have a more of a consensus way of coming about decisions. And so at that point, when you lessen natural selection within the group, what's left is selection between the groups. In other words, groups that are better organized, more on page, more able to punish free riders, more efficient at forming military units. Those are the groups that are going to survive and prosper. So selection actually starts to favor group selection. So this leads to the idea of group strategies, where you see group strategies as experiments in living. That is, they're not the outcome of natural selection, but they are a way of organizing human affairs in a group kind of way that takes advantage of these mechanisms to ensure group cohesion. And notice I'm citing Richard Alexander again. I think Richard Alexander is very, very important evolutionary biologist. His 1979 book is absolutely seminal in the field and should be read by anybody who's really interested in this field. And he calls humans flexible strategizers. And Richard Alexander was not a psychologist, but in terms of my first talk, that's exactly what I was saying, that humans are flexible strategizers, that having these domain general mechanisms of general intelligence and so on has made humans into a different kind of creature. If you look at most animals, they are not very flexible strategizers. If their ecology changes in some way, they really can't deal with these changes. They're not flexible. But what Alexander is saying about humans, I think, is absolutely right. Flexible strategizers, able to use these rational mechanisms related to general intelligence that are then able to achieve evolutionary goals. So what we're trying to basically get away from the modular psychology as a paradigm, emphasizing more domain general mechanisms, general intelligence, not only being able to solve problems and create technology, but to be able to establish these focused groups And there have been quite a few such groups that can be analyzed in this way. The ancient Spartans in the Greek city-states. I'll be talking a lot about Judaism today. The Puritans in England, a lot of them settled in America. The Mennonites, which is a religious offshoot, I think they started in Germany, in areas of Germany. And the Assyrians in the Middle East, and there are a lot of Middle Eastern groups basically like that. You could also talk about the Gypsies, the Roma traditionally have had very tightly social organized groups, strong group boundaries and so on. And a very important part of this whole process is the human ability to create culture, ideologies, social controls that are able to create cohesive groups. So if you look at all these groups, they all have an ideology about what they're about. If you look at the Puritans, they had a strong religious ideology where God, commanded them to do certain things. Same with the Mennonites. Of course, the Jews with the Old Testament, very clearly written out what the laws are, what the purpose is. The whole thing is pretty much there. The Spartans were, of course, a very powerful ancient Greek city-state, very much controlled. I mean, this was very highly controlled, centralized. Did not really have, all the children, for example, were taken out of their parents' houses, socialized according to a Spartan regime and so on to become soldiers. And every Spartan citizen was a soldier. So group strategies basically work by having social controls. Now, we talked about ideologies, and they are important, but the bottom line tends to be controls. Because after all, I am assuming that people do remain self-interested. I'm not claiming that humans are altruistic, but what we'll see is that social controls are able to establish groups that are more or less altruistic. So the first one that I have here, I got about 8 different things here, is preventing exogamy. Now, exogamy is marrying outside the group, right? And I'm going to talk mostly about Jewish societies. I've done most of my research on that. But if you look at traditional Jewish societies, they would keep genealogies very religiously. I just have a bunch of examples, a few examples here. If you look at my books on this, I've got quite a few more. In Spain, this medieval court ruled that plaintiffs were of pure descent without any family taint, that they could intermarry with the most honored families of Israel. And it was very important to establish, going back in your genealogy, that all your ancestors were other Jews. If you had been found to have, if you had married a slave or some convert or something like that, it was a blot on the family, and that meant lowered social status, lowered marriage prospects, and so on. No admixture of impure blood in the maternal and paternal line. Eastern European Jewish communities, the family with yikus, which is a Hebrew word, I guess, which is basically your standing. It would certainly relate to your ancestors. How many scholars were in your ancestors? How many wealthy people? It's your sort of reputation based on your ancestors, fundamentally. And that, of course, is, did your ancestors marry outside the group? So the family with yikus will strive to maintain it, to keep its purity unsullied, if possible to augment it. Many a girl was forced to renounce her beloved because to marry beneath her yikus would put a spot on the family name. And you would not want to put a spot on your family name. It would be very irresponsible because it would affect not just you, not just your children, but your collateral relatives, their descendants, and so on. And as I say, yikus includes an account of scholars and wealthy ancestors, but just all your ancestors, to make sure that they are all of the Jewish descent. And this has had effects. If you look at the population genetic data now, these are some older studies, but you can see that Jewish populations do cluster together. In other words, they have maintained genetic integrity. They are a biological unit, as you were. You can see there the upper columns in boldface print, Eastern European Jewish, Southern European, and so on, have remained cohesive as a group. The outlier are the Yemenis Jews. They may not be entirely related. Some other data dispute that, actually. But they've also done some more recent data. It's actually a sort of a hot area of research right now. This guy Hammer has done a lot of it, focusing on the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is interesting because it doesn't cross over. It sort of stays the same from generation to generation because it's just passed from the male. There's no change in the actual Y chromosome. And again, if you look here, Jewish populations clustering together, even though these are populations like the Ashkenazi Jews have been living in Europe for a long time, still you see, if you look at the Y chromosome is coming much more from the Middle Eastern area, close to the Syrians, Kurdish, Turk, and Palestinians. That's very close to the Palestinians, which is sort of ironic, I guess. Yemenis. So in this data, that group is fairly close. The Druze and so on. So these are other Middle Eastern groups. So the point is, after 2,000 years, the Y chromosome of Jewish males tends to be from the Middle Eastern area. There hasn't been that much crossover. You're not going to understand this, but the point is that this is the interesting study that they found that when they look at the populations of Jews far away from the Middle East, that what seems to have happened is that Jewish men have gone out in general and married local women, and after that original marriage, intermarriage, they remained separate. That is, there was no more intermixture. And it's shown basically by the fact that there's more variation in the non-Jewish groups. This is mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down in the female line. And what they're saying is that the Jewish populations have less variation, suggesting very few women were contributors to the gene pool. And so that the idea is that after this original event where the men came out and sought wives, those communities are basically closed off, no more intermarriage, and would explain that other stuff. I thought I had another one here. Okay, social controls may also facilitate group strategies by preventing cheaters. Remember we said the fundamental problem with altruism was getting rid of free riders and cheaters. And so essentially, when you have a cohesive group, you're able to solve that problem. You raise the cost of defection, and one of the ways that it has been done is to include sanctions on the reproductive opportunities of all genetic relatives of the defector and their descendants. So again, in my books, I have a lot of examples of this, but I picked up a couple here in medieval Spain. If someone was to convert away from Judaism, it was a blot on the family. This disgrace of one convert in a family was enough to cause to warrant the disruption of the wedding engagement of an innocent relative. His former brethren regarded him as a renegade and ostracized him. So the point is that one conversion is not just going to affect you. If I decide I don't want to do this anymore, I marry someone else, it's going to be a problem not just for me, but for all my relatives. So you talk about this innocent relative. You know, my brother, his marriage is now messed up. So everything is going to get messed up. So the point is, the motivation then is to stay within the group, because to do so is to mess up your whole family. Very difficult to do that. This is an example of Synod of Frankfurt. Illustrates community controls over individual behavior or linked to penalties on family members. If it is proven that any Jew has had drink wine in the house of a Gentile, it shall be forbidden for any Jew to marry his daughter, to give him lodging, to call him the Torah, to allow him to perform any religious function. And so the idea is that if someone were to do that, it's sort of breaking down those barriers. Jewish communities in traditional societies set up strong barriers between themselves and the surrounding population. And this is one way it would be maintained. If they saw somebody who was cheating from defecting, you'd punish not only him, but his entire family. And of course, there were informal controls sons of converts were ridiculed. They would go in the street, they'd be insulted, they'd be spat on. So it'd be very hard for such a person, someone who were in other words, it was a daunting choice to decide, I'm going to go this route. A third way that social controls can facilitate group strategies is by creating optimal socialization environments. Essentially what all these groups do, we're talking about the Assyrians, talking about the Puritans, the Mennonites, and all the Spartans, that they tended to restrict socialization with the culture of the surrounding peoples. So that was part of the previous synod. You wouldn't be able to drink wine with people, but just simply restricting contact with members of outgroups. And of course, socializing for in-group identification. It's very important to get the children on board, very young, to identify with this, to think that that they are part of this group. And here's just a long quote from Raphael Patai. He was actually famous ethnographer, historian, intellectual. And it's interesting, this quote here, he's talking about life in Hungary back, say, in the 18th century, probably 19th century. As I began to reconstruct the life of my grandfather's family, I received the distinct impression that the life of my grandfather and that of the Hungarian peasants of Patá had almost nothing in common. The contact between my grandparents and the peasants of the village was confined to the occasions when the latter stopped by the store to make their small purchases. Apart from this, my grandfather lived entirely in the world of Jewish tradition, primarily the Talmud. He knew almost nothing of the cultural traditions of the peasants. Both grandfathers and grandmothers' clothing was different, so Jews in traditional societies took pains to have different clothing. You'd be able to recognize them on sight very easily. So with their hairstyles, they would look different. They ate different food. The strict separation of milk and meat dishes, you could even tell going into the kitchen if this was a Jewish kitchen. If one adds the differences between the intellectual interests of a learned and traditional Jew and those of a Hungarian peasant, and between the ethos of one and the other, one reaches the conclusion Hungarian Jew lived in practically complete cultural isolation from his purely Hungarian environment. So it's almost like two different universes. People living in the same area but being in a totally different universe, different social mores, ideas, and so on. Social contacts were completely businesslike, no encouragement. We talked about the Frankfurt assignment a minute ago. Entertainment, fraternization, all reviewed as bad, deplorable things to be relegated, restricted. And they were enforced even more strictly as time went on after the medieval period. Dietary laws were actually one way of separation because it would prevent a Jew from eating a meal in a non-Jewish home. Religious authorities inveighed against these occurrences, however exceptional. Socialization environments are very important to all these isolated groups. Big attempts are made to have positive in-group feelings, and a big part of that is holiday celebrations, bar mitzvahs and so on, where everybody comes and tend to have a good time, the positive, accentuate the positive. And of course, we mentioned the in-groups are going to be separated by signs of distinctiveness in clothing. So when you're a child, you would understand you're going to dress a little differently. You're going to know that anybody who sees you on the street is going to know that you're Jewish, and the Hungarian, certainly the non-Jews would have the same attitudes. A sense of common fate, the belief that your fate is intimately entwined with the fate of the whole. And this sort of touches into altruism. If you really believe you have a common fate, that if my fate is intimately wound up with that, you're far more willing to give, to be altruistic under those circumstances. In these groups, they tend to be small, and they work probably better with smaller groups. The social psychological literature would certainly support that small groups would have more of a sense of control because you know everybody and so on. And of course you would have distinctive norms and values, kosher food, intellectualism versus non-intellectualism for the peasants and so on. And there's been some writing on socialization in traditional Hasidic groups in New York. One of the main things is simply keeping out television and media. They don't have any media, don't read newspapers, so children are not aware. They don't know about about baseball or sports. They don't know about politics going on at the national level and so on. They don't watch television shows. You have a lot of very positive community experiences, chanting in school. And there's an attempt to sort of make the context that this goes way back in history, that you see yourself doing this chanting stuff, and it's been done for centuries, that someone would have been doing this 700 years ago, the exact same prayers, the exact same way. These kids spend 16 hours a day with their peer group. They don't spend any time at all with the people outside their peer group. They're studying. Everything is communal. And they have a strong sense of traditional correct behavior. Notice taking precedence over individual decisions. So again, this is the group mentality. As we said, natural selection seems to operate at the level of the individual, but what you have are these groups that sort of overcome that. And notice it's not easy. I mean, if it were really easy to produce these kind of groups, you wouldn't have all these massive socialization measures. But you actually do have that, of course. And contrary behavior is not tolerated by the community. If you do act in a way that's not approved, there will be ostracism and so on. Bad things will happen. Another thing is that social controls can promote selection for things like intelligence. In other words, you can design breeding. You can emphasize, encourage certain types of people to breed. And in the Jewish community, there's a very clear emphasis on the importance of education, intelligence, and so on. So these are some quotations from the Talmud. A man should sell all his possessions in order to marry the daughter of a scholar, or marry his daughter to a scholar or other man of character, because he may then rest assured that his children will be scholars. But marriage to an ignoramus, which is a fool, will result in ignorant children. For a learned man to marry a daughter of an ignoramus is like planting a vine among thorns. One sees that scholarship is dying out in his children. He should marry his son to the daughter of a married man, of a learned man. So again, all these prescriptions in the Talmud telling people what to do, and in fact they were carried out because these things were taken very seriously. If you look at the Code of Maimonides in the 12th century, he makes the claim, no man should marry his daughter to an unlettered person, someone who has not any education. For one who gives his daughter in marriage to such a husband is as though he had bound her and placed her in front of a lion. I mean, it's a huge, extremely negative connotation there. Seeing that the beast's habit is to smite his mate and have intercourse, since he has no shame. A man should go so far as to sell all his possessions in order to marry a scholar's daughter, for he should die. For should he die or go to exile, his children will grow to be scholars. Similarly, he should marry his daughter to a scholar, since there is no reprehensible thing or strife in the house of a scholar. And in traditional Eastern European society, parents, this is from the anthropologists Zebrowski and Herzog, parents dream of marrying their daughter to a learned youth or their son to the daughter of a learned father. The matchmaker, who's very important institution in the shtetl, has in his notebook a list of the eligible boys and girls within range. Under each name is a detailed account of his yikus, that's his genealogy, how many wealthy ancestors, how many scholars in the background, in which the most important item is the number of learned men in the family. So you can't overestimate the importance of learning and scholarship, intelligence within the community. The greater the background of learning, the better the match. Now, I've sometimes been misunderstood by people when I've written about this. They seem to think that my idea is that there are a few rabbis who were smart or something like that. It wasn't just a few rabbis. What you had in traditional Jewish communities was a strong overlap between wealth and scholarship and family connections and political power and, in the end, reproductive success. Because reproductive success, of course, is the bottom line in an evolutionary perspective. And reproductive success is then going to create these pressures for increase in IQ at the genetic level. In other words, it is eugenic to have this kind of group of people at the top of the society. What's going to happen is that the genes for higher intelligence, for being better scholars, and the other traits in this group are going to sort of come together, and you're going to create a very intelligent, effective elite. Scholars had a lot of other advantages. They didn't have to be, super famous or anything. They had access to better marriages, earlier marriages. They could often live with a wealthy father-in-law when they were very young. They get married when they were 13, very young. And they would get business opportunities. And in traditional societies, wealth has always been correlated with reproductive success, having more children. Because wealthy people had better health, better medical care. They ate better food, lived in airier, more healthy environments, and so on. They didn't have to pay taxes, and they were often supported by wealthy people. So being a scholar was a huge advantage within the Jewish community. It gave you better marriages and everything. And it was a very good thing for wealthy people to benefit their scholars. It was strongly encouraged to give them gifts, to support them, and so on. Then they would be able to marry, of course. The officials of the Jewish community also acted to regulate the marriages of the lower classes. So if a poor Jew wanted to get married, it was kind of hard because they would insist that he have a certain amount of money. They did not want to have to support him later because in Jewish communities, all the charity came from within the Jewish community. It didn't come from outside. So these regulations, they would insist on dowry payments. They would say you couldn't have any charity at all for a few years, say, and they would restrict how many poor Jews could get married. So again, what you're having is this sort of pressure for the elite people, the smarter people, the people with more money, to be able to have better marriages, and more children. And it actually did have that result. If you look at mid-18th century Poland, prominent Jews had 4 to 9 surviving children. Poor Jewish families, 1 to 2. So a huge selection difference. This is going to have a huge effect over even a few generations in moving the average IQ of the population. And when you look at studies of Jewish IQ, there seems to have been an effect. Now, there have been a lot of different studies. They don't always agree, but the one common denominator is that they tend to be higher than the intelligence of European populations. So 1948, the highest estimate, Jewish day schools, 121. Now, the European mean is 100, so that's really a substantial difference. National representative, 117. This one, all the Jewish kids in Glasgow, so that's pretty representative, I'd probably say. Also very high. Herrnstein and Murray, which is the bell curve, the very controversial book on IQ and so on. Their Jewish sample was 112. They weren't sure it was a representative. Recently, Richard Lynn had a sort of lowball estimate of 107. So I don't know. Whatever it is, it's higher than average. Okay, the fifth way that social controls can facilitate group strategies is by you have psychological mechanisms that respond facultatively. Now, when I say facultatively, it means that if something happens, if there is an external threat, then these mechanisms are turned on. If there's no external threat, then they're not turned on. That's what facultative means. So I had a lot of examples in the book. I didn't put them in the talk here, but there are a lot of examples where when kids are taught Jewish history, they accentuate the negative. In other words, persecutions are emphasized. And I noticed that also in other groups. I looked at the Assyrians. They have a strong sense of martyrdom going back hundreds of years. So Jewish kids are going to a Jewish school will learn about the Spanish Inquisition. They will learn about persecutions during the Middle Ages. They'll learn about the Russian Tsar and how bad he was to the Jews and so on. But that's also the same with the Assyrians. They have a whole long list of people who persecuted them over the centuries, and they're constantly aware of that. A big part of their self-conception is as being persecuted. But perhaps more theoretically important is enforcing altruism within the community. Cohesive groups, all of these groups we talked about, tend to have high levels of within-group charity. They enforce charity within the group. Now, this is the free rider problem. This is the problem of altruism and charity. And it's often buttressed, supported by very elaborate sanctions and rewards. So some examples of this, again, the anthropologists, Zebrowski and Herzog, the greatest negative sanction was simply that of public opinion. Again, ostracism, cold shoulders, gossiping, raised eyebrows. In other words, you're doing something inappropriate. And humans are very sensitive to feeling that they're not doing the right thing, that people don't like them, that people question them or something like that. The social cost of avoiding this was so severe that very few would brave it. And if they did try to avoid their obligation, if you were a wealthy man, you had a lot of money, but you did not contribute to the charity within the community, they would call you up to read the Torah. They would practically insist on a contribution, and then they would announce it to the congregation and so on. In other words, it's very public. You were expected to do it. If you didn't, bad things happen, and they would provide a great deal of pressure on you. But there were also a lot of positive incentives. People who did contribute a lot had a huge reputation within the community. It was a source of admiration, a source of power, a principal source of your reputation depended on this commitment to group goals, to the group charity, and so on. Being wealthy was not as important as being generous to the community. So the rewards of charity were so far-reaching, so many levels, and so on. It was almost irresistible. Second only to learning. Learning was still number one. Okay, what about psychological processes? Because I do think that groups are maintained ultimately by social controls, but certainly some psychological processes are contributing to this. And Phil Rushton, well-known evolutionary psychologist, proposed genetic similarity theory as a way of understanding why people sort of congregate together. First of all, people choose similarity in spouses, friends, and pets. So even when people get married, they are more alike. They're more alike on IQ. They're more alike on personality. If you look at your friends are more alike than average to you than on all kinds of traits, just about any trait you can imagine. In the same way, if you're entering business with someone, if you enter business with someone who's sort of like you, then you sort of share the costs, you share the benefits, and there's less defection from predators. So these are some slides that Rushton actually lent me. And the point of this is to show that similar people tend to get married. And this is Princess Diane and Charles. Now, they actually got divorced, so I'm not sure how great an example this is, but they certainly do sort of look similar. And their kids sort of look similar too. The idea, again, of genetic similarity theory is that you're sort of more closely related to your kids, that they're more like you and share more genes, etc. They're not. This is actually a Mormon with his wives. And the point is, you got this guy with all, most Western society, all Western societies are monogamous, but these Mormons out in Utah, they have multiple marriages. So here's a guy with 9 wives. And Russian's point is that these women all sort of look alike, so they're sort of selecting for similarity in their gene pool. Even gay people. These are just friends, I guess, and more friends. Biker guys. I guess they look alike. You sort of hear, I don't know. They're certainly dressed alike. And there's actually a report on do dogs resemble their owners, and yes, they do. How about that one? Pretty similar. Yeah. Anyway, so the point is that similar people sort of coalesce together, whether it's animals or not. And so one of the things he did was to simply give psychometric tests to people and see how similar you are. And notice, if you look at demographic variables like race, religion, and so on, very highly related. Attitudes and opinions, about, say, abortion or death penalty or something like that. Notice IQ. We talked about IQ being very important. Well, it is important when people choose friends, when people get married and so on, about 0.37. Physical attributes actually less, and personality even less. I think personality, maybe because I don't think we really measure personality very well. It could be higher than that. This is sort of an introduction to the next stuff. We don't need to do that. But Russian wrote an article called on this a few years ago, 1989. And basically what he finds is that traits that are more heritable, that are more genetically influenced, seem to be the traits that people assort more on. That is that if you look at friends are more similar in things that have stronger genetic influence. And they're not as strong on things that show less heritability. There's less genetic influence. And the same thing for spouses. When people get married, they tend to resemble each other. Notice these correlations are not that high, but they are significant. They're higher than in the population average. Low heritability, very low, pretty much zero. When it comes to cognitive traits, even higher, 0.54 in this set of data. Suggesting intelligence is probably pretty important for sorting people to getting mates. Friend similarity, however, is higher on more heritable social attitudes. Perhaps attitudes give people more something in common. You're both interested in sports or something like that. But even blood level, and this is sort of astounding when I first read this kind of stuff. I mean, it really blew my mind that it's understandable to me that you'd have assortment for IQ or something, but when blood type, I mean, like very odd because we don't see blood type. It's not something that we can notice. I have no idea what your blood types are, and you don't know what mine are. But nevertheless, when you take blood samples, you find this pattern of similarity again. He's got a study of twins, 174. This is a recent study that just came out, actually. Monozygotic and dizygotic twins. And notice again that if you look at just pair similarities in MZ and DZ twins, once again, monozygotic twins are more alike than dizygotic twins. And they are approximately the same, and then friends dropping off. But what's interesting is that the similarity of a twin to the co-twin's spouse or friend. So you got an identical twin, and then you look at the twin's spouse. How similar is the spouse to the original twin? And actually, they both have spouses, and you look at the correlation for the spouses. Notice that the monozygotic twins are picking people to marry who are more alike than the dizygotic twins are. It's really interesting, isn't it? That, in other words, having the same genes makes you pick a similar kind of spouse more likely than a dizygotic twin has less genetic commonality. And similar kind of thing with friends, that the friends of monozygotic twins are more alike than the friends of dizygotic twins. So again, people seem to be picking up on subtle cues or traits that are genetically influenced. And they do the formal genetic analysis of this, and about 13% genetic influence for spouses, 30% for friends. Most of the variation is environmental. They don't know what the environments are. That's one of the problems of behavior genetics. They don't tell you too much exactly what it is. The family environment is a shared environment. Notice having a contribution here. Okay, that's it for that. But there are other processes that affect group formation. My general view is that something as important as groups is going to mean that a whole lot of different psychological mechanisms are going to be important for producing a sense of group identity, attraction to other group members, and so on. And one theory that I think is very important for that is social identity theory. Now, William Graham Sumner, a long time ago, 100 years ago, stated this. He said, "Loyalty to the group, sacrifice for it, hatred and contempt for outsiders, brotherhood within, warlikeness without, all grow together, common products of the same situation, often sanctified by religion." Think of how many times people from differing religions have gone to war about theological issues of various kinds. Still happens. Men of the others group, that's the out group, are the outsiders with whose ancestors, the ancestors of the we group, waged war. Each group nourishes its own pride and vanity and looks with contempt on outsiders. Each group thinks its own folkways the only right ones, and if it observes that other groups have other folkways, these excite concern. The point is that modern psychology basically corroborates that. He was just an anthropologist making an observation. Modern psychological research has pretty much validated that. A classic study, 1966, Sharif randomly took children, brought them into a summer camp, and they just divided them up into two groups, and they started having them compete. What started to happen is that group membership was a huge part of social identity. People developed friends within the group, not outside the group. And of course, these are just randomly chosen kids, so they're all homogeneous, the same ethnic group, they look the same and so on. Just randomly put into these differences. And notice the groups developed negative stereotypes of each other, and the quote from the paper, they were transformed into wicked, disturbed, and vicious children. So these are kids just randomly at a camp, no hostility to start with, but putting them into competing groups produced these kinds of consequences. What? About 5 minutes left? Okay. I can finish part of this. Both in-groups and out-groups are perceived as more homogeneous than they really are. In other words, if you're in one group, you see this a lot. I'm in Los Angeles area. We have gangs all the time, and one thing you see there, that the in-group is perceived as all, tough and strong, and the out-group are evil and bad. So, in other words, they don't look at individual differences. That some kids may be nicer than others, some kids smarter than others. If they're the out-group, they're all stupid, and if they're in-group, they're all smart, kind of thing. And so people tend to not look at individual differences, how people differ from each other, and they tend to stereotype. They think of their own group as having positive stereotypes, the other group is negative stereotypes. This leads to sharpening of group boundaries, feelings about the in-group that are negative, discriminating in favor of the in-group against the out-group. And of course, they positively value the in-group traits. We're the smart ones, they're the stupid ones, that kind of stuff. And Now, it is possible these negative attitudes and behavior towards outgroup members can be muted, there's lessened by prohibitions. In other words, you can make social controls like we talked about before against harming outgroup members. And certainly in our society in the United States, we have a lot of laws about harming outgroup members. But in countries without these laws, you still see an awful lot of this kind of group conflict. As Horowitz says, in one country after another, other ethnic groups are described in unflattering or disparaging terms, and it's certainly true. Well, I only have a few minutes. Let me mention that social identity seems to be an adaptation in the biological sense. That is, the tendency to view your own group as superior is universal. That's been replicated from Vine. We tend to have this bias in favor of in-groups and against out-groups is automatic and implicit. Remember in my first talk, I talked about these modular mechanisms. The key point about modular mechanisms is that they are implicit, they're unconscious. Well, we're saying that social identity is one of these modular kind of mechanisms. The responses are implicit, that people aren't conscious necessarily that they are have biases against out-group members. So these processes occur very early in life without specific knowledge of the out-group and so on. You even see this in animal societies. Chimpanzees, like humans, divide the world into us and them. So you have pitched battles between chimpanzee groups. Johan van der Dennen talking about advanced species having very strong group delimitations based on emotional mechanisms. And what's interesting about social identity is that during times of resource conflict, you see more conflict, more competition, more threat. People have a stronger sense of identity, and what I'm saying is that it implies that they do track a group interest, but as the group starts to get bound up with the individual, then they sort of have to side with the group. I have to skip some of this stuff, I guess. I did want to say one more thing, because just to tie it with the previous lecture, that we talked about domain general mechanisms, we talked about intelligence, and I'm saying that these are very important for these groups. Group strategies achieve their psychological force with mechanisms like social identity theory, genetic similarity, and a couple of other mechanisms I was going to talk about. But they also take advantage of domain general, these rational mechanisms of intelligence that I talked about in the first lecture. And for example, in a modern society, these groups have to navigate the institutional structure of a multi-ethnic democracy. In the United States, we have all these different groups. They're all trying to lobby to advance their interests in various ways. It's very difficult, and you have to understand a whole lot of things about the process. You have groups like AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. La Raza is a Mexican group. National Association of Colored Peoples, African American group. The ADL is a Jewish group. They have to know how Congress works. That's IQ. That's domain general mechanisms. They have to know how to win elections, give money, and so on. They establish these defense and interest groups. They have to go to court. They have to have very sophisticated legal information and so on. That's all domain general stuff. And of course, they have to monitor group members. So, just one more, can I do this one more thing? This is really cool. This recent study just came out in Nature. They had these black and white subjects in America scan photos of black people and white people. And then they had to match the race of the target photo with comparison photos. And what they did was they did these MRI scans of the brain, and they showed the activation of this part of the brain that is responsible for fear. And when they were scanning for blacks. And the point is, this activation was involuntary, it was unconscious. It may well have been learned, but it's sort of overlearned, very rapidly brought to mind. But when the subjects were given the verbal label African American with the photo, then there was no response in the brain region responsible for fear. And so the idea is that it was interpreted as due to inhibitory control from the prefrontal cortex, which is all about general intelligence. That's where we talked about the general intelligence being able to suppress the impulses originating from lower in the brain and so the idea is that the moment you start thinking about race in words and culture and so on, you as soon as you put it into words, it seems to sort of dampen these sort of emotional feelings. And I think that is why the control of culture is so important in humans, that we try to take over the rational space of the brain. We can't do much about the amygdala and the lower parts of the brain. So anyway, the conclusion is that groups are psychologically compelling because of our evolutionary past, but by using domain general mechanisms such as general intelligence, groups are able to effectively conceptualize and pursue their interests in the modern world, far removed from the environments we evolved in. Thank you.